Alright, so this video is going to be a tier list of Christian death albums. I'm not going to be covering every single Christian death album or every single related side project, but I am focusing on most of the full-length albums of the 80s, a little bit of Shadow Project and Christian death featuring Roz Williams from the 90s, and like 2 or 3 other albums I'm just going to toss in there for comparison's sake. So to explain my rating system real quick, S is for just like all-time classics. A is for very strongly recommended albums. B is for albums that are mostly pretty good. C is for albums that aren't even remotely noteworthy or might have a few good tracks and the rest aren't so good. D is just straight up, just pass on it. And F is strongly F is like the bad stuff. It's like, this is not only forgettable, it's entertaining that it exists. So, I'm not going to beat around the bush much, because I don't want this video to be like an hour long. So we're going to get straight into it, and we're going to go chronologically. So, Christian Death's first album, Only Theater of Pain. To be kind of honest, it's going to go on an S tier, mostly just because of how important of an album it is, how well received it is. But I think it's also a pretty good album too. It's got like the original lineup of Christian Death that's not like on any other of the albums. It's kind of like the most punk sounding album they've released. Yep, it's definitely going into S tier. Okay, so second album, Catastrophe Ballet. So this is the first one with the second lineup of Christian Death. So pretty much what happened was the band broke up in the early 80s, and around 1984 there was supposed to be a European tour for Christian Death. Roz was asked to go on tour. He didn't have a band, and there's different stories about what was really going on, but he pretty much recruited another band, Pompeii 99, to play with him. And Pompeii 99 was made up of Valor Kand, Chitaine Dimon, and David Glass. They're kind of like a more experimental band, not really a punk one, so the sound of this album is really different. Kind of a big Bowie influence. Sounds a bit more goth rock than Only Theater of Pain. And overall, I like this one more than Only Theater of Pain. It's like less edgy and more like interesting. I can't, with good judgment, put it above Only Theater of Pain just because Only Theater of Pain is S tier, but it is clearly A tier. It's a very good album. I highly recommend it. Ashes is the second album with the same lineup. The only thing that really changed was the bassist. The bassist on Catastrophe Ballet was Constance Smith. And I do not remember who the bassist was on Ashes, because they keep switching through bassists so often. So Ashes is like Catastrophe Ballet, but make it weirder. There's not a lot of songs on it, only 7. 2 of them are like filler intro and ending songs, but the songs that are on there are really good. They're longer, got more diverse instrumentation. You can hear a lot more Chitaine Dimon's vocals from when compared to Catastrophe Ballet, which is always a plus. She's a great singer. So I'm going to have to put this also in A, and probably a bit ahead of Catastrophe Ballet. I feel like it's a bit better. So, after Ashes, the band kind of split a little bit, so Roz Williams left the band. Originally, there was an agreement that the rest of the band would continue playing under Sin and Sacrifice, but they slowly backed out on that. Kind of don't entirely blame them, though, because Roz kind of really did just bail out on them in the middle of the tour, and he kind of, split up the previous band, too. So people act like the Valor era is totally different, but I feel like that's not 100% true. So the 3 members are shared in common between Ashes and Atrocities. You've still got Valor Kand, David Glass, and Chitaine Dimon, but now we're adding in Barry Galvin and Johann Schumann, who would later form Mephisto Waltz. So you're actually kind of getting like an interesting combination of sounds. You've got a little bit of the Mephisto Waltz sound mixed in with the Christian Death sound of the last two albums. So even though you're losing out on Roz Williams, which is kind of a big loss, it's somewhat made up for by having some Mephisto Waltz members on it. It's like, I really like the album actually. I think it's easily in the same tier as these two. Having Barry Galvin on it really does make a difference. He wrote like a good chunk of the songs, and the ones that Valor wrote are also still pretty good. There's a few songs on there that kind of are skippable, but there's nothing like bad or too boring on there. So, Barry Galvin and Schumann did not last long. They ended up leaving the band right after Atrocities. And instead they added another second guitarist and bassist, James Beam and Kota. James Beam ended up also playing for Jatan Damon's solo work later. I don't know if Kota's done anything else. So the Scriptures, it's kind of got the most sort of traditional goth rock sound out of any Christian Death album. It sounds a lot like the goth stuff that was coming out in the UK at the same time. Kind of gives me some like Gene Love's Jezebel vibes just a little bit on some of the tracks. It's also kind of experimental. A lot of the experimenting doesn't really work super great. So a lot of the stuff's weird. It's not really something you want to listen to all the time, but it's not like cringe level experimentation either. It's just a few filler tracks. Some of the tracks that are on there are pretty good though. There is a cover of Jimi Hendrix's 1983 sung by Jatan Damon, which is really amazing. Some other songs like Four Horsemen that are pretty catchy, and Jezebel's Tribulations. While the lyrics are ridiculous, the song itself is like really catchy. So it's got like a good variety of instrumentation, pretty creative even if it's paint by numbers, late 80s goth. I definitely would put this in B tier. This is the album where people really get mixed on. Most people still like not most people, but a lot of people will admit Atrocities is pretty good. The Scriptures is where people are really split on, but I think it's easily a decent album. It's not among the band's best, but if you like the other stuff, it's worth a try. So the album after that was Sex and Drugs and Jesus Christ. So for this one, they lost at least one other member. I know they lost David Glass. I do not know if James Beam was still on this album. And this one, well, it's not great. Pretty much Jatan Damon saves this entire album. The tracks she sings on are all great. The other ones, not so much. They kind of went for a slightly heavier sound here. So there's like some harder sounding guitars, but it's not a good, satisfying kind of hard. It's more like noisy. It might work in like an industrial context, but not so much in a rock one. Weirdly enough, this is Christian Death's most successful album at the time of its release. Obviously, it's been totally eclipsed by Only Theater of Pain, but when it came out, it kind of had a buzz. I feel like part of it has to do with the album cover. It's got Jesus shooting up heroin, and that's bound to catch attention. I feel like, though, this is really when the band started to fall off. There are some songs on there like Incendiary Lover and This Is Not Blasphemy that are nice songs, but for the most part, I put it in C tier. You might want to like download a few songs from the album, from MP3s or whatever, but I wouldn't listen to the full album for fun too often. Of course, after this album, they lost even more members. Pretty much it became a ValorCon solo project for these next two albums. And they were double albums. Have All the Love and All the Hate. All the Love it's a bunch of different things. It's a whole giant mix of genres. I do not know what Valor was thinking releasing this. It sounds nothing like anything else the band has done. I don't see where we would think this would appeal to what the people who are listening to Christian Death would have wanted to hear. I haven't really listened to it super in depth, because it didn't really interest me much. I'm only going to put it in F tier because it's just weird. I don't really have any super big complaints technically with the music other than that. Why? All the Hate, though, is definitely the worst of the two. It's pretty much like Sex, Drugs, and Jesus Christ minus anything good about that album. You just excise everything good from it, and you're left with a pretty mediocre industrial rock album. And it's like vaguely industrial rock even. Like, none of the songs are really memorable. I kind of was like, just felt like almost listening to... It's not really white noise. There's obviously music being played. It's just not good at all. It is the worst Christian Death album out of any of them, including all the later Valor albums. So after these two, Valor Khan's Christian Death was somewhat dormant for a while. They didn't release another album for a while. And in between that time, there are a few albums by Shadow Project and later Christian Death. So Shadow Project was another band Roz was involved with. It was kind of a team up between him and Eva O of Superheroines. They were married at the time. It also had Jill Emery from Superheroines, who would later join Hole. And it had Paris Sardonis, who worked on some other stuff with Roz. And there's different drummers on each album. There's not much of note about the drummers. So originally, the lineup had Barry Galvin and Johann Schumann in it. There's an EP of that. I'm not really going to cover that. I've mostly been passing over EPs. Death Wish EP is included on Only Theater of Pain. Wind Kiss Pictures is similar-ish to Atrocities. It has the same lineup. Going back to the first Shadow Project album, which is titled Shadow Project, it's probably the very punk-sounding, little bit of a metal edge to it, because it's got Eva O on guitar, and Eva O's style is very hard rock. Personally, I'm not crazy about this album. It doesn't interest me too much, but I'm not going to let my personal biases affect it too much, because I know a lot of people do like Shadow Project. If you like a harder sounding punk album, it's pretty good. It doesn't really sound too much anything like goth rock, though. It's more, even calling it death rock, it depends on how you would define death rock. I'm probably going to do a whole separate video on that, because what gets called death rock can be kind of weird when you really look at it. I'm going to have to put this in B tier, solely because I know a lot of other people like it, but I don't think it's like super amazing. The second Shadow Project album, however, Dreams for the Dying, I like that one quite a bit more. It's a bit more creative. It's a little less punk-oriented, and it's got more variety in the songs. You got like some really heavy stuff like Zaned People. I know there's this one song on there which is mostly just Eva O's vocals, and they're like really dramatic and spooky, and it like sounds really good. Probably more so than even any of the other albums. I don't even know how Shadow Project gets lumped in with goth or death rock. It sounds more like a metal album, albeit a really experimental one. Like the other Shadow Project album, I'm going to bump it up one because I know people really like Shadow Project, so I feel like this can go in A tier. I mostly enjoyed it, actually, compared to the first Shadow Project album. So after Shadow Project, or I guess even kind of before, I think this first one was actually released before Dreams for the Dying. You had this album Iron Mask. So it's Roz Williams, Eva O. I forget if there was anyone else on it. But it's pretty much just re-recordings of old Christian Death stuff. And generally, I would not even include it on this tier list because it's not really an album of new material. There's like one new song, Skeleton's Kiss. But this album keeps, if you're on a streaming site, they're going to play songs from this album, and you're going to wish they didn't. You're going to wish you were hearing Only Theater of Pain or whatever other song that it was on from that album, because it's not good performances on this album. It's like, do you want to hear old Christian Death songs done worse? No, I don't think anyone does. Some people kind of like this one. I don't feel like this album has any reason to exist. I'm putting it in D tier because it's not completely terrible. It's not like the songs are awful, but it's just like pale in comparison to the original recordings. And during the time, it was called Christian Death featuring Roz Williams because there was kind of like some lawsuit involved because Valor was technically had rights to the name, even though during the early 90s he wasn't really using it. So under Christian Death with Roz Williams, there were 2 albums of newer material. I've heard like different kinds of rumors about it. Some people are saying this was originally meant to be Shadow Project stuff. Other people are saying they were recorded together from the same sessions. I'm going to evaluate them as separate albums, though I'm going to consider both of those when I'm evaluating them too. So the first one, Path of Sorrows, it kind of goes back a little bit in the direction of Only Theater of Pain mixed with the sound of Shadow Project. It's definitely the slower of the two. There's like a lot more, there's some kind of pseudo spoken word bits, some like more atmospheric guitar playing. My one big complaint about this album is that although it says featuring Roz Williams, you don't really hear him singing by himself much. There is almost always Eva O in the background, giving her like super spooky voice under it, kind of almost drowning out Roz's vocals a lot. And in certain spots, it's effective. It really adds to the music. A lot of the time, though, it's just too much. Beyond that, I kind of like the songs. It's like a lot moodier than some of the other Christian Death stuff. And I feel like overall, I'd give it a low B. By comparison, Rage of Angels, I don't like that one as much. It reminds me of the first Shadow Project album. It's like more of a straight-ahead punk with a little bit of hard rock sound to it. Again, there's a lot of Eva O's vocals mixed with Roz's, so it's kind of hard to really just hear Roz. Main problem with this album is that the songs just aren't very memorable. They're not like particularly great. If Rage of Angels and Path of Sorrows were like, if they really were part of the same recording session, if they just took the best kind of from both, you'd have like a really good album, but they don't. I'm going to have to put this one really high up in the C because I don't even really know anyone who's all like, boy, I really love the Christian Death album Rage of Angels. You'll see some people saying Path of Sorrows was actually pretty good. Not many people like Rage of Angels. So it came out in 1994. The same year, Valor Khan finally put out another Christian Death album. This time, he was collaborating with a new collaborator, I think it's Mayatri on bass, and she would be like collaborating with Valor Khan for the rest of all the Christian Death albums from this one onwards. I'm not going to go into the rest of the Christian Death albums with Valor Khan past this one, because mostly they're like industrial metal stuff. A lot of it seems to be very Marilyn Manson-esque. A little bit too different from what we're going over. I've heard the newest one is actually pretty decent, but I'm not going into that one. However, Sexy Death God is kind of interesting. So it sort of picks off from where previous Christian Death albums with Valor were. So it's kind of got like that heavier goth sound. But unlike Sex and Drugs and Jesus Christ or All the Hate, it actually doesn't sound that bad. There are definitely some lyrical parts that are just like really cringy, like damn you or deeply, deeply, where you'll like shout, damn you. Or you'll like go into deep voice, deeply, deeply. And it just like sounds ridiculous. But like, it's not like straight up metal. You still got like some nice bass parts or a little bit of processed guitar leads. You can hear some of his violin playing in there, which like spices it up a bit. I think I actually technically like it better than Rage of Angels, but I feel like there's a little bit of bias because I'd expect Rage of Angels to be good, and I'd expect this one to suck. I know a lot of people don't really like later Valor Khan stuff too, so I'm not going to weight it too heavily. I think I'm going to put it in C tier though. It's not terrible. I'm sure if you like go through it, you might not like most of it necessarily, but there's at least a few decent songs on there. And just for like interesting contrast, I'm going to throw in Mephisto Waltz's album, The Eternal Deep. Technically, this is a compilation album. It's made up of a bunch of tracks that were mostly written in the 80s under the previous incarnation of Mephisto Waltz. So originally, Mephisto Waltz had a male singer. They went through two different male singers in the early 80s. First one was George, second one was Mondo. In the 90s, they got a female singer. I think it was explained so it wouldn't sound so much like Christian Death. So it had Christiana on it. So I feel like this one is worth bringing up because it's kind of got a similar sound like the first full-length Mephisto Waltz album, Thalia. I think it was Thalia. I forget the title of it. But yeah, the first one was kind of almost Cocteau Twins, kind of real dreamy, but this one's got a punky edge to it because it's like really early songs. You even got one song, Silent Thunder, that was also on Atrocities. You can hear it again with a different vocalist. So this album, it's amazing. I feel like it is better than both Christian Death featuring Roz Williams and Father Khand. And seeing as it's got like three former members of Christian Death that were on Atrocities, I feel like it almost kind of is a spiritual successor to that in some ways. Not necessarily the other Mephisto Waltz albums, but this one, because it's still got a little bit of punk edge to it. I feel like this one definitely belongs up in A. Arguably, it's pushing S tier, and it's not necessarily the fairest comparison because this really is technically a different band. But I feel like it's important to note that some of the former Christian Death members were actually making some really good stuff too. So yeah, this is overall kind of the tier list I've got. If I was to continue doing Father Khand Christian Death albums, they'd pretty much all be in D tier. I don't think any of them are going to be as bad as All the Love or All the Hate, but I don't think any of them are going to be particularly good either. Maybe the newer one might be up higher. And just for some like other albums I think are interesting that I didn't rank because they're just too different sounding. You've got the album Roz Williams did with Jatan Damone, which is called it was called Dream Home Heartache, because it's got a cover of In Every Dream Home a Heartache by Roxy Music on it. It's kind of like a duet album. It's if you liked some of the Jatan Damone like piano songs on both Atrocities and the Scriptures, then you'll probably like this one too. It's got like a lot of stuff like that. I kind of skimmed through it. It sounded pretty good. There's also kind of interesting if you're like want to look for more stuff like Shadow Project. There is the Eva O Halo Experience, which came out in '94. The idea behind it is interesting. So Eva O converted to Christianity, decided to make like a Christian music album. It's still got a lot of the sound of Shadow Project in it, only a bit less heavy. It's not a bad album. I didn't really give it a good listen to really say how good it is, but it's not terrible despite everything about it sounding like the worst. It's probably worth checking out as a curiosity, if nothing else. It could be very good. Like I said, I didn't give it a full fair listen. That's another reason why it's not on here. And Mephisto Waltz listed some other albums. I'm not going to do a tier list for Mephisto Waltz later, probably. So I'll say most of their albums up to about 2004, which the band calls their second incarnation, are all really good too. If you liked Eternal Deep. And there is one more Shadow Project album that came out in 1998 called From the Heart. It's mostly acoustic stuff, mostly acoustic versions of Shadow Project songs. It's actually pretty decent. Like I said, I didn't give this one like a full listen through either because I wasn't going to put it as part of this list. I think I might want to listen to more of it later though, because there's one song on it in particular, a cover of Forever Came Today by 10cc, I believe, that like sounds really good. But yeah, it's acoustic duets with Roz and Eva O. I kind of liked what I did hear of it. It might be worth checking out if you want like more acoustic versions of Shadow Project. And yeah, so this is kind of my list. And there's a reason I made this list too. So I didn't just decide, hey, I'm just going to randomly rank Christian death albums. I decided I should do this because I feel like sometimes the singer of the band gets overweighed to the overall sound of the band, and it kind of like downplays the role the other members made. And I feel like kind of the lesson that can be learned here a little bit is the band Christian Death is only as good as like the sum of its parts a little bit. So obviously most of the ones with Roz are good, but Roz alone can't necessarily make an album amazing. You do need the other members to like kind of pull their weight too, especially since Roz was just a singer. He didn't like really write the background music. And at the same time, even if Valor's lyrics are kind of not great a lot of the time, with like a good backing band like he had on Atrocities, you can actually get a pretty decent album. There have been a lot of talented musicians that have come in and out of Christian Death over the years. So it's worth checking out as many albums as you can if you're interested. This is probably a good starting point to know where to listen to. Start with Only Theater of Pain. Listen to Ash's Catastrophe Ballet and Atrocities, and then from there kind of go on down the list is what I'd recommend. See how you like stuff. And if you like certain things, you can kind of more dig into other stuff that's similar. So I'm going to end my video here. I hope people found it helpful. I know I can kind of be rambly and stuttery, but hopefully people enjoyed this. And if you feel like I put some albums in the wrong place, if you would rather do your own list, feel free to leave a comment about whether you agree or disagree with my choices. And I'm going to put a link to this tier list for people to make their own. And you can feel free to share it with people you know. Say, hey, this is what I think about the Christian Death albums, how I feel like they should be ranked.